out of control. A North Korea-backed cyber group has been accused of carrying out an online espionage campaign to steal UK secrets. The National Cyber Security Centre says the group has been compromising organisations around the world. It believes they were trying to access classified military and nuclear secrets. The Prime Minister insists GB Energy will drive down bills as he announced plans for a state-owned energy firm. The proposals include a partnership with the Crown Estate to develop new offshore wind farms. It's also designed to cut the UK's reliance on energy imported from other countries by generating more of its own electricity. Chris Venables from Green Alliance has told LBC every little helps.
For every, new wind farm you build, or, whether that's offshore or onshore, or for every solar panel you put on a roof, you're having to buy a bit less gas to power homes. And over the long term, we're protecting ourselves from these really volatile global markets that are kind of, owned by people like Putin and states in the Middle East whom we would have questions about.
And there's a call for people with O-type blood to book donor appointments urgently. Stocks are said to be really low, especially in London, after a recent cyber attack. The NHS has issued an amber alert. In the city, the FTSE 100 closed up 32 points at 81.86. The pound buys $1.28 and €1.18. LBC weather: rain in southeastern areas clearing eastwards tonight. Scattered showers persisting in the northwest but largely dry elsewhere. Lows of 8. A dry start tomorrow with plenty of sunny spells and patchy cloud. Scattered showers will develop in the afternoon, mostly for northern and western areas. Highs of 24 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Amelia Cox.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening. It's 3 minutes past 8 on LBC. You're listening to Iain Dale. I'm here with you until 10. Now, we're streaming this hour. We always do on a Thursday, and we like to have one person in the studio to take your calls. And today we have got Sir Liam Fox. Now, the reason he's come in is not to talk about the fact that he's no longer an MP. I hate to sort of mention that at the beginning, Liam, but we have to. Though we will talk about the future of the Tory party in a bit. But he's got a fascinating book out. And it's about water. And you think, well, how can water be fascinating? It's not the usual thing about, well, should the water companies have been privatised? Isn't it terrible that we have so much sewage in our water? This is the big picture. And it's called The Coming Storm, Why Water Will Right the 21st Century. Now, I said in my talk-up, Liam, that I think it was about a dozen years ago, you and I had a conversation and you were trying to convince me that energy security was the biggest issue facing the nation.
2008.
No, it wasn't.
It was.
Was it?
Yeah.
I thought it was like 2014. Oh dear. Anyway, and I can remember...
What a good memory you have.
Well, I do remember it, but I remember thinking at the time, because I just didn't quite get this, and I was thinking, oh, that's all very interesting, but I didn't really take any notice, and I should have done, because you were absolutely bang on. And now you're issuing a similar warning about the future of the planet with regard to the supply of water. So just take us back to the beginning. What has made you write the book?
A number of things. It's been a pet project in my head for a long time, from my medical perspective as a doctor, and the fact that we still have, 3.5 million people dying of waterborne diseases in the 21st century on our planet. And then from a security point of view, the fact that as we have a rising global population, we've got the same amount of water. Competition for any resource is likely to lead to tension. And the one thing that we cannot do without is water. And where people will fight for other commodities, back to our energy security, try that on water. And it took us 2 million years to get to a population of 1 billion. It's taken us 200 years to get to a population of 7.8 billion. And we've got the same amount of fresh water that we require. It's also distributed in a very dangerous way. You look at some of the places where there are tensions on the planet. The Jordan Basin, we know we've seen some of the problems there recently. Tibet, and you can see it with Turkey and Iraq and Syria. Lots of places around the world where there are potential flashpoints. And then I wanted to write also about healthy, clean water and sanitation. I'm a big supporter of WaterAid, the charity. I think they're one of the great forces for good in the world, which I hope people will support who are listening to your programme. And then you've got the fact that we could be dealing with a lot of these for very small amounts of money. And then you've got the great scandal of what we're doing with the wider oceans, our plastic pollution and the human sewage going into the oceans today. And, you don't have to be a believer in the reasons for climate change to understand that we've already had a sea level rise of some 30 centimetres and more is baked in. All of these things will have an impact on the problems that we talk about, the symptoms, such as migration, global poverty and so on. But there is still time for us to do something about these before we reach these crisis proportions. And you mentioned that, water, why would it be an interesting subject? It's blindingly obvious that human beings require it. But in our discussions around it, we tend to put them in silos. We don't really put together the issues of aid and development or climate change or economics or security and look at them in the round. And that's what I wanted to do, and tell it in a way that was more a story than a textbook.
Because in a way, lack of water is also going to drive population movement, isn't it? And that, I mean, we already think that sort of immigration is too high, sort of all the people coming from the Middle East, from Africa. Some of that is being driven by climate change in those countries. Some of it is being driven, and presumably your contention is in the future it'll be more driven by the lack of availability of water.
Well, you can see where the potential for conflict comes, and conflict always produces displacement of people. And I was pointing out in the book that over 40% of all the people on our planet are dependent for either their drinking, industrial or agricultural water on a river that arises on the Tibetan plateau. So that's the Indus, Ganges, Brahmaputra, the Mekong, the Yellow and the Yangtze. And as the glaciers melt, there'll be a lot of water for a while. Then there'll be a shortage of water, 40% of the planet. And China controls the headwaters of every one of those rivers today. Because it controls Tibet. And China's interest in Tibet is not, the Dalai Lama, so I hate to disappoint Richard Gere that this is the big issue. The big issue is control over natural resources, number one of them being water. And we need to waken up to understand, as you say, the big picture, not focusing on, how much, important though it is, how much waste water was discharged into the Thames last year, and take a look at it in the global perspective and try to understand things with a bit of scale to it. And then, as I said, we've got all the big health issues. We in Britain, here we are in London, one of the cities that was the first in the world to get proper sanitation, which defeated cholera, which helped propel Britain economically. And yet, here we are in the 21st century, when 2.2 million children are dying of waterborne diseases every year. And to put that into perspective of getting our numbers right, the 3.5 million people every year, that's the equivalent to 3 9/11s every day, or 6 Titanic sinkings every day. That number of people dying of waterborne diseases would fill 90,000 seats in Wembley Stadium every 10 days. And sometimes I think we talk about these numbers and they don't really mean anything to us until we can put them into a human and understandable context.
So what can be done?
So there are a lot of things that we can do. We can do a lot of things through our aid policy, directing it in the right places. The UN Millennium Goals actually put clean water below gender equality. Now, you can't actually get gender equality unless you've got access to water, because if you've got girls walking for 2 miles twice a day to get water, how do they ever get into education? And I think it's a question of trying to get some proper priorities in our international policy.
You can't get gender equality if so many children are dying.
Well, and as I said, you can't get if they can't get into education either. And then you've got things we can do through the World Health Organization, more immunization still than we're doing today. We've got a lack of treaty provision when it comes to shared water basins. We don't have proper treaty on international plastic. And when you think about the fact that, we've got somewhere between 15 and 50 trillion bits of plastic in the oceans now. Last year we saw the first snow polluted by microplastics in Antarctica. There's now nowhere on the planet that's not affected by that. And yet you've got five countries, that put more plastic into the world's oceans than the rest of the world put together. That's China, Thailand, Vietnam, Philippines, and Indonesia. We need urgently to be addressing these through the various protocols that we can have through a range of different international agreements.
I mean, China is massive.
They don't
aren't.
recycle their plastics. They just dump them straight into the oceans. Now, we should be using all the levers we have. If you want to join the OECD, as Indonesia does, well, let's do something about your pollution. More plastic was produced in the first decade of this century, of the 21st century, than in the whole of history up to this point. So this is a problem that's accelerating. And I think one of our duties is good stewardship of the environment that we inherited, and we can't simply use it as a dumping ground. And the bottom of the oceans, where most of this will sink to in the end, is going to become a global dustbin unless we take action. So there are lots of... it's easy to write the depressing bit of the book, but there's a whole section, as you know, at the back that says what can be done.
But do you think there is... I mean, obviously, I guess part of the point of writing the book was to promulgate knowledge of these issues. But do you think that this is an issue that, like, the new Labour government is on top of, or other governments throughout Europe really give any consideration to?
No, I don't think there is a wide enough awareness of the issues. As I say, perhaps some of the issues are looked at, but in isolation. For example, if China controls all those headwaters and you get a supply drying up, China's going to divert those. Of the 58,000 large dams in the world, China controls more than half of them.
Here's a text from Robin Kings Lynn who says, perhaps Liam will give us his views on second home owners who create strains on our water and sewage infrastructure, not to mention the pollution they cause travelling from, say, Tunbridge Wells, which is where I live, to Norfolk, where I also live. Thanks for the dig there, Rob.
I mean, it's not to say that some of these issues are not important in themselves, but you have to understand the scale of the global problem. You cannot solve global issues from a national base. We do need international cooperation. We can do some stuff. But I was comparing at a book festival I was speaking at, people were saying, it's disgraceful the amount of water that was dumped into the Thames untreated because of flood overflow. Saying, yes, but it's 1 over 1430 of the pollution that goes into the Danube every year. Because a third of the citizens of Belgrade are not actually attached to any sewage whatsoever. They have septic tanks which are dumped into the River Danube, undiluted, the equivalent of 60,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools every year. It puts maybe the problems of second homeowners into perspective.
Take that, Robin Kings Lynn. I shall be driving up to Norfolk tomorrow night after the show, by the way. Well, as I say, I think this is a much more fascinating issue than I think many people will have thought. I hope the book does well. We'll talk about it a little more. And if you've got any questions on anything related to the supply of water, what can be done to remedy the situation, Liam's going to be with me until 9 o'clock, 0345 6060 973. We're also going to talk a little bit about the future of the Conservative Party in a moment and anything else that you might want to bring up. It's 8:15.
This is LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
16 minutes past 8. Kenny in Liverpool says, I missed the start of the programme. Could you please tell me Liam's name and second name so I can order the book? Well, you know his first name is Liam. His second name is Fox. He was a former defence secretary in the coalition government, Conservative MP. Sadly lost his seat at the election. Well, I say sadly. I genuinely mean that because you and I have known each other for a very long time, haven't we? And I always think it's, the number of people that I knew who lost seats at the election. I mean, I've tried to send messages to some, but there's just so many. I mean, Rishi Sunak has apparently phoned each. Or have you had a phone call from him?
Yes,
I think he has phoned
the day after the election.
Everybody, which can't have been a very pleasant experience for him because I imagine you all blame him.
I think it said a great deal about him to do that. It's very easy to say, well, I lost the election, woe is me. His first reaction was to think about his colleagues. And I think that says a great deal about the man. And I was very impressed by that. I've had several conversations with him since the election. But I had, like with many colleagues, thought about whether I would stand down after 32 years in the Commons, whether I would do that. And I decided, actually, given the state of the polls and so on, that I had probably a better chance of holding on to that seat than most. And we lost only by 600 votes, where the seats around us fell by the thousands.
But from your point of view, was that a good thing? Because you must have had thoughts sort of in the dark moments of the night. We thought, well, if we'd done that, if only we'd worked that bit harder, we could have got those 600 votes back. Whereas if you'd lost by 4,000, no chance.
I was saying when we were at the count and we were getting the result, I said, I used to tell my patients, there's no point complaining about the air when there's nothing else to breathe. You get on with it and you take the knocks and you move on. Fortunately for me, I had a number of very big projects I was involved with. The book's just about to come out in America, for example. And we're in discussions about doing a potential TV series related to it. I also chaired the UK's Abraham Accords grouping, which is where I intend to put most of my energy. So I think if you had nothing outside politics, you might find it a great loss. It's disappointing. I wouldn't pretend it's not, but it means also you have a time liberation that you have sometimes forget about. And after 32 years, where you are restricted by when Parliament is sitting, and your weekend's been taken up by constituency work, suddenly to have a diary where you can control what you want to do yourself, there's a certain liberation to that.
And you either regard these situations as threats or opportunities, don't you? You could just wallow in self-pity for the next 6 months. I did an interview with Eleanor Mills, who used to be editor-director of the Sunday Times, and she'd been there, I think, 25 years. And she was called in to the bosses one day. She didn't see it coming, and she was let go. This is 4 years ago. And she said, well, obviously I was absolutely devastated. But she's now... she's written a book all about what it's like to be sort of in your 50s and not knowing quite what's going to happen next. So she's actually set up a new business, and it's called Noon, and it's all designed to. It's aimed mainly at sort of middle-aged women, and she calls them queenagers. And she's actually set up this marvellous business, and she's more happier than she ever has been. So it's actually been almost a blessing in disguise. Now, I wonder if in 4 years' time, you're going to think, well, I'm really glad I lost.
Oh, it was a pretty good disguise. I had all these projects because I had thought that I might not stand, and I'd put my mind to a range of other issues. But it sort of raises another point, doesn't it? That if you've had a life before politics, if you've known that there is a life outside, then it's not so frightening to be coming out the other end. I worry about those who go from university to become special advisors straight into becoming MPs. Let's leave aside that if you want to run a country, you should probably do it the courtesy of knowing something about it. But for them, if you've never known anything else other than that, how can you be possibly prepared for a life outside? So I count myself as being very fortunate because I'm involved in a number of projects that I'm desperately personally involved in. So I'll be able to spend more time in all of those. in a way which I think will be fulfilling. And we also have a bit of a tendency to think that the only way you can influence events is through a political system. Increasingly, that's not true. And I look at charities like WaterAid, and I think that they have done more than most governments will in terms of liberating people from their inability to access clean water and sanitation. And that's a real tremendous thing to have done for other human beings.
And you lost to Labour, whereas sort of there was a time, I imagine, when the Liberal Democrats were your main opponents in your seat, because it's in the West Country. Yeah. So people automatically think, well, that'd be a Lib Dem Conservative seat rather than Labour. Why
the Liberals were until the coalition, and after the coalition, they got thumped. And Labour didn't do particularly well in my seat compared to last time. The Conservative vote, like many places, went way down. And I lost by 600, but Reform got more than 5,000. And I kept meeting people who said, we're going to have a protest vote. You'll be fine because you've got a great big majority. And I said, well, not if you all protest, you won't. And now we've got a lot of buyer's regret, I think, out there. But, in a democracy like everything else, people have to understand that choices have consequences. And that's the choice they made.
So what do you see the future of the Conservative Party as? Because obviously the leadership contest has started. I think there are three candidates so far. I think Mel Stride is announcing tomorrow, so that will be 4. There's at least another 2 that will put their names in the ring. Is it all about the new leader, or is there something much more fundamental that needs to be addressed?
Much more fundamental. I think in court that might have been called leading the witness. So I think that we need to stop this nonsense of treating politics like an episode of X Factor, where you pick the leading personality and you hope that by some magic they will have the agenda that you actually support. I think that there are 2 things that the party needs to understand. The first is, as Margaret Thatcher used to say, and I'm a great fan of Margaret Thatcher. I used to work with her and knew her very well. She used to say that we avoid external coalitions in our politics by maintaining internal coalitions. And the reasons we can go into would take for a long time, but there's no doubt that in this election, the Labour Party under Keir Starmer, however banal you thought it was, maintained their internal coalition. The Tory Party fractured its coalition. We need to find a way and an agenda that holds that together, which is the second point. We need to go back to first principles. You can't be a party just with a hodgepodge of policy. You need to go back to what you actually believe on a whole range of things, on social policy, on defence policy, on economic policy. I was once on a flight with David Cameron when he was Prime Minister and I was Defence Secretary, and we were going to Afghanistan. And we were talking about the Tory party rather as we are now. And he said, I regard myself as a liberal conservative. Liam, how do you regard yourself? And I thought, well, this could be a career-defining answer. And I said, well, I regard myself as an unreconstructed, free market, Thatcherite, unionist, Eurosceptic Atlanticist. I think that we do need to know what we are. I think we need to understand what the Conservative Party is. We can't lurch off to one extreme rather than another. We lost a lot of votes to Lib Dems, as well as to Reform, and to a lot of Conservatives who just stayed at home. People who didn't want to vote for another party but felt that we were no longer worthy of their trust. That needs to be re-established. And you don't do that simply by being a collection of factions. You need to set out an agenda that clearly puts the interests of the country and a set of beliefs in front of the country to show that you're worthy of being the government and to be trusted with the future of the country.
But it was interesting, I thought, last night to learn that Tom Tugendhat, who's seen as a sort of one nation candidate, the first thing he writes about in the Telegraph, launching his leadership campaign, was, I'm ready to pull out of the ECHR. Mm. And you think, is that your main selling point? I mean, obviously he's trying to attract people from the right, rather like David Cameron did on the pulling out of the
EPP,
European People's Party, and that as you will well remember, that attracted a lot of support in that leadership.
Yeah, it was actually my idea during that election campaign. Yeah. But let's. But here's the thing, isn't it? We're not going to be making any decision about that for 5 years. So rather than having these emblematic and totemic policies, it's better to set out what we will do from first principles on the big issues. You know, some of these issues we're talking about on water, on what are the causes of global migration. It's not just Britain suffering from it. All European countries are. The United States is. What's the relationship between that and the global protectionism that we've been part of in recent years? Let's try to think back to deal with not the symptoms of the problems and a series of policies designed for that. Let's think about the big picture. Let's think of not how we get growth in our economy, which is a treasury term, and you stick an extra million migrants into the country and they all go shopping. That's called growth. When what we really need is wealth creation in the country. How do you get all these young entrepreneurs, the great creativity of Britain, unleashed so that we create more wealth in our country? Because unless we can create more wealth, it becomes academic what you want to do with public services. Unless we get more wealth created, then we'll have to make constant choices between more tax or cuts in spending. And for the moment, the Conservative Party needs to get back to its ideological roots and to talk about who it is rather than discussing which newspapers you're going to get on side in a period where, let's face it, you don't matter at all in the electoral cycle. The opposition for the first 2 years at least is largely an irrelevance.
Yes, because no one wants to hear from the Conservatives at the moment and probably won't for another 2 years.
And we'll have people who, understandably, have been ministers and, you know, the press wanted to talk to them every day and the civil servants hung on their every word. They no longer have that importance. And sometimes, you know, having watched a lot of political cycles, sometimes it takes some people a little longer than others to recognise that.
Do you think everything has become a little bit too fundamentalist, where you are either sound or you're not? And that's particularly true, I think, on the right. Whereas, I mean, I keep being told that I should just go away and join the Liberal Democrats because apparently I'm a lefty. I mean, I don't know sort of how people have worked that one out. But I'm thinking, well, I believe in Brexit, still believe in Brexit. I believe in low taxes. I believe in a small state. I don't believe in PR. And yet somehow people of the reform tendency seem to think that I no longer belong in the Conservative movement. And I'm thinking, well, you're not going to drive me out. My views are roughly the same as they were. I'm still a Thatcherite, but Thatcherism has to be adapted to the 21st century. We're not in 1990 any longer. And people just think you have to belong in a silo. And you have to, if you don't believe 100% in everything that particular party says, then you're not really very sound.
Ronald Reagan used to say, you know, never speak ill of fellow Conservatives. And I go back to the point from Mrs. Thatcher, that Mrs. Thatcher always maintained a broad church. She had people in her cabinet she fundamentally disagreed with, but she also believed that they were legitimate strands of conservatism and that it wasn't a single issue or a single view that should be expressed. And let's face it, if you want to win a general election, you have to appeal to enough people on the right of the centre of the spectrum to be able to do that. And I think part of this has come from social media being an echo chamber of people with similar views and algorithms driving people back into these same conversations. And also the changes in our media, which allow people only to watch programmes and stations which they fundamentally agree with and therefore don't have a challenge to their views. And challenging your views is healthy in any society, because how else do you know how to justify unless you listen? And of course nowadays, as the polls will tell us, there are lots of people who don't watch current affairs at all because they're, quote, not interested. And I remember in this conversation with William Hague, and I was saying that people nowadays didn't watch enough of these public affairs. He said, yeah, but when you and I were young, there were only 3 TV channels and the news was on 2 of them at the same time and your parents watched the news, so you didn't have much option. And I think politics, we have to find a different way of having a conversation with voters to establish our relevance in a world where it seems less relevant. It will rise up again in relevance when we face collective danger, as we do on a number of fronts. But I think that sadly, we often get to that point of crisis before people understand the importance. And like you, I mean, when you talk about the disappointment, I look back on my time in Parliament, and the one thing that I'm absolutely unequivocally pleased about is the fact that we managed to persuade the British people to leave the European Union, which for many reasons for me was one of my raison d'etre in politics, as we used to say when we were in the EU.
Yeah, quite. and you have been consistent on that right through your political career, which there actually weren't many sort of Brexiteers, because you were first elected in 1992, weren't you? And there's like Ian Duncan Smith, Bernard Jenkin. There weren't that many, and it's amazing how that then became a big thing on the right. But I think most people actually, I mean, I didn't decide to vote Leave until David Cameron's failed renegotiation. I was always Eurosceptic, but I was never a real leaver. But that will provoke a lot of people to phone in, I'm sure.
I was a constitutional leaver. I believed it wasn't about migration, it wasn't about money, it wasn't about trade. It was primarily about the fact that people in Britain should be the ultimate arbiters of their own destiny. We should make our own law. And I came at this because my parents, in the first referendum in 1975, were on opposite sides. My father believed we should be in the common market. My mother, I'm not going to the exact terms he used, but believed that foreigners began at Calais. When the second referendum came, my parents voted on the same side to leave the European Union. As my mother said, after 42 years of careful domestic re-education, your father got it right the second time. But it was in fact a disillusionment with the fact that Europe had developed in a way that he hadn't wanted to see when we joined. And I think that was true for a lot of people of that age group.
Right, we're going to come to calls in a moment. You can phone in on water, you can phone in on the future of the Conservative Party, or anything you like. Liam Fox here with me until 9. It's 8:33. News headlines with Amelia Cox.
The police watchdog says it has met with the family of a man filmed being kicked in the head by a police officer at Manchester Airport. The IOPC is asking people to come forward with videos of the incident, which happened on Tuesday. A £7 million reward is being offered to anyone who can identify members of a North Korea-backed cyber espionage group. It's understood Andriel carried out a campaign to steal military and nuclear secrets from the UK and the US. And a man has been charged under new laws around owning XL bully dogs following the death of a woman in Essex. It's the first time the legislation has been used since it was introduced earlier this year. LBC weather, rain in southeastern areas clearing eastwards tonight. Scattered showers persisting in the northwest but largely dry elsewhere. Lows of 8 degrees.
This is LBC. Iain Dale. Text 84850. This is LBC.
8:36 on LBC. Liam Fox is with us. He's written a book called The Coming Storm, Why Water Will Write the 21st Century. If you'd like to give him a call, the number is 0345 6060 973. I love this text here from Cam on the subject of the Conservative Party. The church was so broad that the roof collapsed. I don't know if that's an original from you, Cam, but if it isn't, I should claim it and claim copyright over it. Right, let's go to Adam in Westminster. Adam, hello.
Hi, good evening, Ian. Good evening, Dr. Fox.
Good evening, Adam.
I'd like to ask you, Dr. Fox, realistically, assuming that Labour doesn't absolutely destroy the economy in the next 5 years or do some things which are absolutely out of this world, what realistic chance, if any, is the Conservative Party of winning the next election?
Well, if you look at the parliamentary arithmetic on precedent, you would say that's not very high. But two things I would say in answer to your question. One is we've seen much bigger swings in our politics in recent years than have been traditional in Britain. And B, the Labour Party are actually only on 34% of the vote. It's interesting that there's been not much comment on that since the election, of course, having been predicted by most of the polls to be in the 40s. They did much less well in terms of popular vote. And it wouldn't take much of a reduction in that Labour vote of 34% to put them into a potentially losing position. The key element, I think, that will be the determinant in the answer to your question is how much the Conservative Party can get its act back together and how much it can actually converse in a meaningful way with the British electorate. I would also say that, in 2019, when we won that election and Boris got a big majority, people said, the Tory party will be in for the next 10 years. And then we were hit quickly with COVID. As we started to recover, we were hit with Ukraine. And I think it does show that we're also, in our governance today, very vulnerable to external events. And I think that's not something that the political class has necessarily taken into account in recent decades. So I would say it's a much more fluid position than some will think. But it's up to the Conservative Party ultimately to remain relevant and to produce solutions and values that the public are comfortable with.
Do you want to play a part in that?
Well, we've just been discussing, I've got plenty of other things to be getting on with, but it would be surprising if I didn't have a view on it.
Well, that's not quite what I asked, though, is it? Because, I've just seen a tweet from Joanna Cherry who says she lost her seat in Scotland and she's saying she's stepping back from politics now. And I wonder whether you've come to the conclusion, well, you and I are the same age, and you're thinking, well, in 5 years' time, would I want to stand at the age, what would it be, 66, 67? Or have you decided that is a chapter closed, even though obviously you'll still take an interest?
Well, there's politics and there's politics. And a lot of these big issues, I think, are international issues. As you know, I was the UK's candidate to be Director General of the World Trade Organization. There's a big agenda there that we haven't finished, that Britain, post-Brexit, should be giving a much greater lead on than we have. And there's still a lot of unfinished business in terms of wider regional and global affairs. And there is more politics than just politics inside constituencies of the UK.
Thank you, Adam. Sarah says, I thought this hour was about water, but it appears to be a platform for the Tories. Sneaky. No, it's a platform for anybody who wants to ask Liam a question. Adam wanted to ask about the Conservatives. Sarah, if you want to...
I was happy to talk about water
Sarah,
all evening.
If you want to ring in and talk about water, feel free. Ranjit in Albury does. Hello, Ranjit.
Hi, thank you for taking my call. Yeah, I want to talk about water. Hello, Dr. Fox.
Hello there.
Yeah. Fleece jackets and, fleece clothing, it's made out of recycled plastics, like plastic bottles and everything. We can see plastic floating around on the sea. We can see plastic, around the parks and everywhere. But when we wash our fleeces, a lot of the microplastics get washed away. And I've noticed that my fleece jackets, each time they're washed, they feel a lot lighter. And what can we do to stop that going into the water system, the microplastic?
Well, of course, the reason that happens is because of how these things are produced, and we need to look at technology to ensure that where we do use plastics, they are properly recycled and that we're not going to lose plastics into the microplastics that you described or the other pieces that end up in the oceans. We also need to match that with a parallel conversation, if I may suggest, that looks at how we get sustainably produced produce in other ways. That a lot of water will go into the production of some of these materials, and we need to start to get the concept in global trade of not just relative advantage, but I think ecological advantage. And we need to try, what I'm really saying to you, Rajit, is that we need to join together the dots on the sort of problem that you're making very clear that exists, but how do we join that into wider issues around sustainability and trade, so that when we are buying things, we actually understand what the ecological impact of what we're buying will be. I bet when you bought that jacket, you had no idea what its plastic content was or what the impact would be of use over time. And we need to have better information for consumers so that we can actually make more informed choices. Ever since I wrote my book, for example, and you may think this is a trite point, but I hope that it's not. I've stopped buying bottled water in supermarkets. I bought myself a SodaStream, and if I want carbonated water, I'll make my own and don't have to be dumping lots of plastic bottles in the bin.
Interesting you say that. Just on that point, and has sent me a WhatsApp message saying, I'm visiting family in Thailand. Interesting, but sadly not surprising to hear from Liam Fox that Thailand is up there in the list of major plastic polluters. One of the issues is that the population can't drink water from taps, so millions of plastic bottles are used and thrown away per day. A direct link between non-potable water, is that a word?
Potable,
yeah. And plastic pollution. I mean, it makes your point for you.
It's a very, very good point. I was recently in a West African country where exactly the same thing was happening. And it's, again, dealing with the plastic waste is in some ways dealing with the symptom, whereas the problem is the lack of access to clean water and proper sanitation. And, it seems odd to me that clean water is so far down the UN's list of sustainable development goals. If necessary, you can live without democracy. Tragic though that is, but you can't live without water. And I think that the access to clean water is one of the most basic, if not the most basic human right that there is. And that's a very good point, well made, that if we don't invest in giving people these most basic facilities, there will be a price to be paid elsewhere. It's not a cost-free option.
Okay, Ranjit, thank you very much. Graham in Canada says, I'm wondering if your guest has anything to say about Canada with its enormous water supply and whether we have any hope for the future, given we really don't live up to our NATO obligations. I think those are two separate points rather than linked, but we do live up to our NATO obligations, don't we?
In the UK?
Yeah.
Yes, we do. But there's a big question about what those NATO obligations ought to be.
Canada doesn't.
I thought I interpreted from what he said about Canada. And Canada is also a very important NATO partner. I think, for what it's worth, addressing that point directly, there needs to be a better conversation about who does what in the non-US NATO countries, including Canada. When I was Defence Secretary and Robert Gates was the American Defence Secretary, we used to, at the NATO meetings, do what we called bad cop and worse cop routine when we would effectively blast the NATO partners who simply weren't spending. And it was a serious point because we said at some point you'll get an American president or the American public that loses patience with those countries that are taking a ride on the back of America's defence budget. I would say we're at or around that now, and Europe's got to show that it's willing not just to spend the money on defence, because anyone can spend money, but that it's doing it in a way that's coherent and not leaving America exposed to deal with Europe's defence problems.
Now, here's probably the most serious question of the night from Elliot. Is it true that you dated Natalie Imbruglia in the 1990s? I need to know, he says.
Well, I would say that if you need to know that, you probably require a level of therapy. But yes, we were very good friends, and yes, I did help her pick Torn Out as a single, and yes, I was on the credits of the album.
Well, there you are. You heard it here. Well, you probably didn't hear it first, but anyway. Right, we have...
I'm not sure what that was to do with either the Conservative Party or water, but...
No, that's some great joy, this. People can ask anything they like, within reason. Right, we'll take more of your calls and texts in a moment. 0345 6060 973. It's 8:46.
This is LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
8:48. Liam Fox is here, or I should say Sir Liam. Have you got used to being called Sir Liam?
Not really.
Are you one of these people who sometimes walks into a broadcast studio and says, "Oh, please call me Liam, don't call me Sir Liam"? Because I had someone, who was it the other day on Cross Question, didn't want to be called Sir. And I said, well, if you don't want to be called it, why did you accept the honour?
I've just found it odd because people referred to me as doctor for such a very long time.
Well, that's because you are one.
It is, and it's taken a thanks level. I like to say, I finally made my wife a foxy lady. So she's...
What do you mean, finally? I hope she's not listening. Right, let's go to Ben in Clacton. Hello, Ben.
Oh, hello, Ian. Yes, the question is, there are new technologies which can change seawater into drinking water. MIT in America has perfected a system for doing that.
Very, very much so, and it's something that's changing the nature of the debate. And if you look at a country like Israel, which has always had a big problem with water and so-called water poverty, Israel now actually produces more fresh water from desalination than it actually requires. And here's how I think that this can work in terms of helping with global solutions. The United Arab Emirates decided that Jordan had a surplus of electricity. Israel had a shortage. Israel had a surplus of desalinated water. Jordan had a shortage. And they therefore helped create the energy, what's now called energy for water swap, so that those two countries could actually, through investment, be able to support one another. And I think it's that sort of creative thinking, using the technologies we have to deal with some of the human problems that we face, that can then be utilised in a way that can reduce tensions across borders and provide a win-win. There are, however, some problems with desalination. It has been, up to this point, expensive in terms of the energy required to drive the process. And of course, you get a lot of waste that's difficult to dispose of, and the problem is that if you simply dump it back into the sea, the very high salinity levels will destroy the ecosystems close to the coastline. So there's a problem with that desalination in terms of how we go forward. But I'm in 100% in agreement with you. It's technology and our own ingenuity and creativity that will enable us to find solutions to these things. And if we understand that, then we can utilize that to take down some of those simmering tensions that might otherwise boil over into conflict. So whether it's MIT, wherever it is in the world, the sharing and development of that technology is the way forward.
We've actually had a few texts on desalination. I think that's the first on LBC. This is from Malcolm in Caddington. I was just thinking about the oceans rising. Why can't we build massive desalination plants around where there are water shortages? Surely this would help on two fronts, sea levels and water shortages. Well, you've kind of just answered that before I even asked.
Well, there are some countries in the world who are really taking that to a limit. If you look at Morocco, for example, in southern Morocco, in the Western Sahara. It's one of the windiest places in the world. It's right on the Atlantic. And they are building solar arrays. It's sunny 360 days a year. It's very windy. They're building wind turbines to power their desalination. So their desalination will be run entirely on sustainable energy, and that desalination will be used to improve and grow their agricultural industry in the country. And it's an example of how you can use ingenuity and bring these ideas together. And when I said at the beginning, Iain, that one of our problems is that we tend to not join the dots, that's a really good example of when, if you do join the dots, you can deal with more than one issue at a time.
Well, they're flowing in on desalination here. Gary in Halifax says, could you ask Liam if solar-powered desalination plants in the Southern Hemisphere would be worthwhile? And Isaac says, I'm from Gibraltar and we desalinate all our drinking water instead of collecting rainwater.
But both of those, the answer is yes, and it's great. Gibraltar I know well because part of my research for the book was done there with Professor Clive Finlayson at Gibraltar University. So if you get a chance and you're in Gibraltar, do drop into the museum and give Clive my very best. And of course, as I just mentioned, there are countries such as Morocco who are doing that very thing and linking these technologies together to be able to sustainably produce and increasing the amount of fresh water. And I should have added to the previous answer, there are technologies developing now able to use the byproducts of desalination to produce other chemicals which can be used for other things too. So it's not all bad news.
Ben, thank you very much for that. David says, I'm not a Conservative supporter, but please thank Dr. Fox for his work in Morocco. So there you are. Because I saw that text and I thought, well, what does that refer to? And
Morocco are part of the Abraham Accords, and we've been trying to bring a greater rapprochement, especially amongst young people. And I'm hoping that in the very near future to have quite a big announcement to make on that. We've got to give young people in the Middle East a new future that is not dependent on their religious identities or their national identities. We need to make them the ownership. We need to give them the ownership of the future, not the past.
M says, just to say, I worked with Mrs. Fox, I think you mean Lady Fox, and she's one of the most committed and interesting people I've worked with, really supportive and pushing research and action for people suffering from lung cancer.
Yes, my wife's the medical director of the Roy Castle Foundation. I mean, there has to be one of us in the family with brains, and she is, I would agree, she is one of the most committed people that I've ever met in her particular field, and very modest with it. So if she's listening, that'll make up for the previous answer I gave to your question.
And if she isn't listening, she can listen on catch up. Gary in Merseyside says, are we ignoring the elephant in the room in regards to water availability? How can the human population continue to grow at the levels it's on a finite planet without stressing the water supply? Do we need to talk about this unpopular view a bit more, that people really need to breathe less?
Well, we do need to think about that population. And it's a very good point. And in many ways, it is still the elephant in the room. And only 3% of the water on our planet is fresh water. Most of it, 97%, is in the oceans as salt water. And the point I made earlier, we've got that same 3% fresh water available today for 7.8 billion, as we did for much smaller numbers. And as I repeat, because I think this is a point worth making, and I'm so glad that point was made there, that it took us 2 million years to get to a population of 1 billion. It's taken us 200 years to get from 1 billion to 8 billion. And clearly with finite resources, we need to think about the size of that global population.
Joe says, Liam Fox is one of those people who, do you want to finish the sentence? Who I simply can't believe are members of the Conservative Party. I really like him, and I really like you, Iain. When will you both see the light? I mean, it's a bit patronising, that, isn't it?
Well, it also buys into this very narrow definition of what a Conservative should be, and there is a. The Conservative Party is a very old historic party. It has generally been at its most powerful when it is a broad coalition. That doesn't mean it's valueless. I mean, the Thatcher government was a broad coalition, yet it was, in my view, very true to the sort of Conservative values that I still hold today. And I think that that's a siren voice that the Conservative Party would do well to aim away from. And thank you very much for the compliment, but I don't share the analysis that the Conservative Party has to be only one particular strand. It's also a message, incidentally, I would be giving to the candidates for the Conservative leadership.
Abdul says, has the book got anything about the River Nile, Ethiopia and Egypt in it?
It has indeed, and it has a large section about the Grand Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia, because when I wrote a previous book in 2012, I talked about how this project was going ahead. And at the time, people said, well, Sudan and Egypt will never allow this to be built because it would give Ethiopia control over the flow of the Nile. It's now been built. It's been filled. And with Ethiopia, you've got a very clear example of an emerging trend in the world, which is the upstream nations and the downstream nations. Ethiopia is a clear upstream nation. There's nothing to suggest that it would use its power in an adverse way, but you would also be foolish not to recognise that power exists. That, I think, is the fact that dam was built, the fact that there was no agreement before the dam was built, will be looked at in other places, most notably, I would say, Beijing.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you for the last hour. I mean, we've got so many texts and tweets coming in here, but we have to finish. Liam's book is called The Coming Storm, Why Water Will Right the 21st Century, published by Biteback in hardback at £25.
£18 on Amazon.
Is it really? Thank you for advertising Amazon. No, well, look, it deserves to really sell, and I hope it does. Thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure, Ian. Thank you.
Now, coming up in the next hour, this was a story that really grabbed me today, because Indigo, which is an Indian airline, has announced a new policy that allows female passengers to choose the gender of the person seated next to them on flights. And you think, well, that's a bit odd, isn't it? Until you remember that throughout the world, and actually I'm told particularly in India, there is a real epidemic of men abusing women and girls. Now, there's enough of it in this country as well. When I first saw it, I thought that's ridiculous. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought, well, good on them for offering women the chance. And then I thought, how prevalent is public groping on transport? 0345 6060 973.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, the family of a man kicked in the head and stamped on by a police officer say they're particularly shocked by the incident because some of their family members are police officers. They've been speaking with their MP for Rochdale, Labour's Paul Waugh. Meanwhile, the Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham's, met with the Home Secretary after the incident at Manchester Airport on Tuesday. He says he's now seen all the footage.
I've had the opportunity now to see the full situation as it escalates, and it does escalate very rapidly, and there are issues on both sides. You can't say that the whole situation